Here's your second video on First Thessalonians, specifically the first video on First Thessalonians 1, verses 8 through 10. And this is the section you'll be going over with your boys. Thank you so much for all that you do, your faithfulness to the word. And thanks to the Lord for his faithfulness to speak through his word to you all, to me, and to the boys of Springdale. So again, every time I start the OIAP, I like to just list out some of the things I'm looking for. Again, you might do that and have your boys do it. I write lists, repeats, compare and contrast, explanations, questions, and things that stick out to me that I want to star. Under the list, you see some things, the locations that they were at. Macedonia, Achaia, everywhere, he says. He lists out God being living and true. And he says that we ought to serve, or the Thessalonians turned to him to serve and to wait. There were some repetitions that took place. You could put Jesus as a repetition and God, considering the previous section that we studied. But specifically in 8 through 10, I see for and from. And for is an important word. This Greek word gar actually gives us just quite a bit of understanding that what's about to happen or what just was said is about to be explained. And so that's why it's important to notice it, because it tells us, hey, an explanation is coming. And that's why you'll see it down here. When I look for explanations, I look for the word for the word so that, and for happens again. From is repeated a lot, especially at the end. They turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God, to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead and who delivers us from the wrath to come. This word is apo, and it just has so much meaning to it because it's having us clue in on one of the most important sections of the letter, one of the most important verses in this section. There's a lot of things to compare and contrast. I would actually say he's comparing, not contrasting, two different things when he talks about sounding and going forth, and we'll talk about that. And gods and idols are contrasted in this, or the living God and idols. I had a question I asked, why did he describe Yahweh as living and true? It's a very Jewish way of describing God. And Jeremiah 10:10 is the place in the Old Testament that uses both of those words together to describe God. And Paul is writing to a primarily what was a pagan Gentile people. And so why did he use this? And then things that I think stick out. Sounded forth in verse 8, for not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you, that'll preach right there. And so we want to look at that. The word sounded forth, the word of the Lord sounded forth from you. It's interesting that we really should look at these prepositions of and from. And what we notice is that the word of the Lord from us, the emphasis on sounding forth is not us and what we do, but ultimately on the Lord. And then there's a point that I'm calling the Jesus crescendo in verses 9 and 10, and we'll look at that, but it's something that I would want to point out. So that's the listing stuff. Let's go ahead and just look at it. Let me give you an overview of what I see, taking some of these observations and how I'd make little interpretations on them. The very beginning is the word for in verse 8. And what it does is it explains to us the Thessalonian example. This word for makes us look back to verse 7. And in verse 7, Paul says that you became an example to all believers in Macedonia and Achaia. And then he explains how they became an example. And he says, the word of the Lord sounded forth from you, and your faith in God has gone forth. But what's important is that Paul doesn't give us or give the Thessalonians these practical steps like, hey, you tithed, hey, you went to the synagogue, hey, you helped that orphan. He doesn't give these practical steps that led to their exemplary lifestyle. He actually lists the agent of their example, which is the word of the Lord. And what's really cool is that Paul is explaining how they were an example, not through practical steps, although he does that elsewhere, but by demonstrating that the agency of their exemplary life was the word of the Lord. And when they have the proper agency, it leads to the proper expanse, which is seen in the surrounding areas and everywhere, like Macedonia. So this 4 explains how they were an example. The explanation of how they were an example is an emphasis not on them themselves, but on the word of the Lord through them. Pretty cool. In verse 8, he goes on, he says, for not only has the word of the Lord, but not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth, but your faith in God has gone forth. I think a lot of times when we hear the words not only, but also, or either, or neither, nor, we begin to make 2 stacks in our mind, an A stack and a B stack. And we begin to think that not only describes A, but describes B, either A or B. That isn't what Paul's doing. In fact, this is not a contrasting statement that he's making between the differences between what it means for the word of the Lord to sound forth and for your faith in God to go forth. He's really comparing. And that's just a tip for you all. Don't go back and forth with your boys trying to differentiate between what it means for the word of the Lord to sound forth from you and what it means for your faith in God to have gone forth from you. Paul in this section, even though it looks weird in the English, like they're contrasting, it really is a comparison. And so to understand what he's saying, we have to see how each of those things, we have to understand what each of those verbs are. What the verb for sounded forth means and what the verb for has gone forth means. And really, you can't understand one without understanding the other because he's connecting them. And I think the best one to understand is the verb that we get for the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you. And that word is exakeo. And I write it in English, so because I think this will come up in our practice. It might be fun for the boys to do, and that's how you would spell it. And I show it to you in the Greek, what it looks like in case some kids are like, ooh, I want to be really cool and write it in Greek. But this word means sounded forth. And it's the word that we translate in verse 8 for as not only as the word of the Lord sounded forth from you. But when we read that in English, we miss the emphasis. This word, exakeo, would have jumped off the page to the Thessalonians who are reading it. It's much more descriptive in the Greek than it is in the English. Because a lot of times when we hear the word sounded forth, we just think of a sound. This word describes a trumpet blast, a bell ringing. I would honestly interpret it as like an echo taking place. And this picture might help you. When we hear the words sounded forth, or when we think of a word picture for that, we think of this point of origination for a sound, and then the sound moving out. So someone claps their hands and the sound goes out. And that's great. But the word exakeo in the Greek is much more vibrant than this word picture. It's more like an echo. When we think of an echo, you have a point of origination for the sound. And the sound goes this way, and then it reverberates back. And it goes this way, and it comes back. And it goes out this way, and it comes back. And it goes everywhere. And the emphasis isn't just on the originating sound, but it's also on the sound itself, the sound going out, the reverberating or report of the sound. And when we know where it's reporting back from, it gives us emphasis on the expanse. Do you see how this picture is so much more, it's like an HD picture compared to a black and white picture. And when the Thessalonians would have seen Paul write, the word of the Lord has exakeoed from you, they would have thought of this. And Paul is commending them for living their life in such a way that the word of the Lord is exakeoed from their life into the streets and the communities that they live. And it really makes you ask the question, like, man, do we live our life this way? Do we want to be people who the emphasis on what we believe is less on us and more about the word of God? It's going forth to the expanse. It sounds like names nowhere, fingerprints everywhere, which is a motto of fellowship. We want to live in such a way that people don't know us, but they know what we believe and what we do, and they see the life change from our beliefs and the life change that comes from Jesus. So really cool word here, and it helps us understand that's also what he's talking about when he says his faith has gone forth. Now, when we know what it means for it to sound forth and gone forth, we have to understand what he means by the word of the Lord, because that's what he says. He says, the word of the Lord has exekeoed from you. Well, I think this would be a good thing. Ask your boys, what's this mean? And if we were to ask them, hey, what's the word of the Lord mean? They'd probably give us a good answer, like, it probably means the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. It means the gospel. And where that isn't not true, it's forgetting that we want to know what the word of the Lord is contextually when Paul writes it to the Thessalonians. And so when he writes the word of the Lord, this of is actually, if you want the fancy word for it, it's an objective genitive. And so you could really translate that kind of like as about. It's almost like he says a word about the Lord exekeoed from you. And it helps us understand that, hey, when he talks about the word of the Lord going forth, he really wasn't describing them as the first evangelists. He's not describing the Thessalonians going out and declaring the gospel in words to the people around them. Although the gospel was in their life declaration, really more what he's painting a picture of is that the Thessalonians lived in such a way as a religious minority in the midst of persecution that a word about the Lord and about their faith just absolutely went everywhere. Picture this, Thessalonica, like we talked about, is this thriving city. And so there's so much going on, commerce, trade, and just picture a tradesman going into the city, setting up shop and beginning to sell goods. And he looks over, and this Thessalonian won't actually make an offering to an idol in the market, like the owner of the market wants him to. And he begins to persecute him for that and kick him out. And this tradesman is thinking, why would this man not just go ahead and make the offering? And later he sees that same person who was kicked out of the market being persecuted in a different way because he didn't make another appeasing sacrifice to an idol. And this tradesman begins to pack up shop and go home. And on his way home, he tells the story of this crazy guy in Thessalonica who was monotheistic and didn't believe in all these different pagans and wouldn't follow the rituals of the culture. That's the word of the Lord that's going forth. This tradesman and these people around them are seeing these religious minorities with unwavering faith, even in the midst of persecution. And despite their persecution, they won't give up on what they believe. And that word about the Lord, that lifestyle speaks about Jesus, about faith, about commitment. It's gone forth. And that tradesman who told his buddies are talking about these crazy Thessalonians who are monotheistic. And that eventually spreads, and a fellow believer hears it and is encouraged because he realizes his brothers and sisters in Thessalonica aren't giving in. And that gets back to Paul. So I tell that to say, verse 8 is huge. It explains that the exemplary life that they have is really example through the word of the Lord. And the word of the Lord is being blasted, trumpeted from them, not just in verbal words, but in the way that they live their life, unwavering in their faith. A huge section is where he says, you've turned to God from idols. And here's what I want to do is I just want to draw it out for you because it's pretty cool to see it this way. Paul is saying that they once were serving idols and they've turned from those idols to God, but he describes God as living and true, which if you think about it implies how he would describe the idols as lifeless and false. And he doesn't just say you turn to God, but he actually gives reason why, which is to serve and to wait. Man, real quick, what purposes is that? Like, that's amazing. Ask yourself that. Is this our purpose in life? So often we think our purpose is to push our agenda or be right. But Paul says their purpose for turning from the idols to the living God is to serve God and to wait for his return. And that implies, in this time that the purpose of serving idols would be to appease them so they're not mad, and they, don't send a famine on you and your family. And rather than wait would be to maybe win them over. And maybe you've done more than just appease them in their wrath, but you've actually won them over to like you and give you special gifts. How opposite is that of the God the Thessalonians serve and we serve? We don't try and appease our Father as if we can change his attitude towards us. We serve him because he served us. And we don't try and win him over with certain sacrifices. We wait for him, the ultimate sacrifice, to return to us. In fact, we're not winning him over. He's won us over. And what you see is that when Paul is describing this turning from lifeless false idols to the living and true God, again, it jumps off the page. It is this stark difference between the way that the people of Thessalonica would live and the Christians within Thessalonica would have lived. Really, really cool. A fun, little exercise you could do is ask the boys, what are the idols in your life? What are the ways that they're lifeless? What are the ways they're false? And how can you turn from those to God? And have them listed out. Man, an idol is basketball. I see it's lifeless in this way, false in this way. The next thing I'd point out to you is this Jesus crescendo. If you think of music where it builds up, that's what I'm talking about. Verse 9 to 10, Paul talks about how you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who he delivers from the wrath to come. Paul goes, and it's almost like he's building it up to this big pronouncement of who he's saying God is. Jesus. Really cool, really unique, really a beautiful way of writing it, where it just grows into Paul finally proclaiming the very name of the living and true God as Jesus the Messiah. The last thing I'll point out in the interpretation section is this word wrath. It comes at the end. Jesus who delivers us from the wrath. That's probably going to be like the word chosen, like last time. Kids are going to want to talk about it. Here's what I point out. This word wrath is the word orge in Greek. And it's very different from the word suffering. Suffering is the word thlipsis. And this speaks of pain, suffering, tribulation, like present enduring of hardship that believers can go through in the present time. Wrath in the New Testament, orge specifically, speaks of the coming judgment on idolatrous and non-believers. And what Paul says is that Jesus, the one we wait to come from heaven, we don't wait to go to heaven, we wait for Jesus to return to us and redeem us, is the one who delivers us from this. Even if we experience suffering in this present life, Jesus delivers us from the wrath to come. And those who might not experience the suffering, or so they think, because of their indulgence in idolatry and whatever it is, they are the ones who will experience the wrath to come. Just a little info for you as you go. Here's how I would apply it. Really simple. I love the ring forth, the exokeo. Hey, let's be people who, like the Thessalonians, ring forth the word of God and the living and true God. Man, that's a great application. How would we do that? Well, we could serve others. Perfect. We could sit with the kid at the table who doesn't have anybody sitting with him. We could help with brother's homework, whatever it is. Great goal, great application, great goals. How do we practice it? I think the easiest one, or a great way to do it, is memorize verse 8. Have everybody do it. How good is it to memorize scripture, put it in there, but to talk about the word of the Lord sounding forth from us everywhere and the faith in God going forth. Man, what a great memory. And so as a practice to do these things, memorize this verse together, encourage each other in it. Man, Luke, you've done such a good job sounding forth the living and true God. Remember to continue in your ways by serving and sitting with that kid at the table. Or maybe you guys, memorize 9 and 10. And remember in there that we've turned from idols, we've turned from laziness and pornography and idolatry, and we've turned to service of God, which is serving those around us. So if you have any questions, call me. Proud of you all. Let me know how I can help.